In 1867, on the quiet outskirts of Lewisburg, where the road narrows and the pines lean in close, stands the Avery place, a weathered house whose windows always catch the last light before dusk, set on a rise that looks down toward the hollow. Folks say it's been there longer than most can rightly remember, and so has the woman who keeps it. Mrs. Avery is known clear across Greenbrier County as the Good Widow. During the long, ragged years after the war, she took in broken men from both sides, soldiers with wounds, still raw lungs, still rattling, or minds still lost in the smoke. She fed them, housed them, nursed them until they were strong enough to walk away. Or so the telling goes. Yet in Lewisburg, kindness can turn in on itself, and stories can fray just where you most want the truth. By the winter of 1867, more than one man had gone up that road and never come back. The neighbors spoke softly if they spoke at all. Before we descend further into what truly happened in that house, I'll ask just one thing, stay with this story. You don't have to like or subscribe unless you feel it. But if what you hear unsettles you, if it reminds you of things people prefer not to talk about, then maybe this story still matters. And maybe you're the kind of listener who doesn't turn away. From here, we will tell the whole story. In 1867, 2 years after the Civil War had ended, the outskirts of Lewisburg in Greenbrier County, West Virginia, still felt like a scar lying just beyond the reach of the main streets. From the courthouse steps, it took half a day on horseback to ride out past the last whitewashed fences, following a dirt road that wound through low hills and stands of old pines worn thin by the wind. The farther you went, the fewer neighbors you saw. Houses thinned to weathered cabins. Then only the faint grass-swallowed traces of wagon wheels remained. By the time the evening mist began to settle, the whole countryside dipped into a deep violet hush, quiet enough for the wind in the trees to sound like running water. The war had left its mark on these hills as much as on the men who wandered through them. Across the South and the border states, there were soldiers who had gone home to nothing, no farm to work. No family left to claim them, sometimes no home at all. A man could survive the battlefields only to find himself limping down strange roads, an empty sleeve pinned to his jacket, or a cough that rattled deep enough to wake him at night. In the towns, these men were tolerated but seldom welcomed. Some took day work when their bodies allowed it. Others sat on benches outside the general store looking like they were waiting for something they couldn't name. Many drank when they could. A few simply kept walking. To those who still had land, such wanderers were a reminder of how easily fortune could be stripped away. They came with stories of Shiloh, of Cold Harbor, of the wilderness, places the war had burned into the nation's memory. But more often they came with silence. And in that silence, there was something unspoken. They had no place that needed them, and no one who would ask where they had been. Some of those men sooner or later heard about a woman just beyond Lewisburg who would take them in. Not for pay, not for the church, but because as the story went, she simply wanted to help. Her name was Margaret Avery, a widow in her early 40s whose own husband and son had marched away with the Confederate Army and never returned. She lived alone in a weathered wooden house with a dull tin roof, its boards patched from more than one kind of lumber leaning slightly under years of wind. The townsfolk knew her as the keeper of wandering soldiers. They said she could nurse a fever down with nothing but willow bark and rest. She knew which root to boil for the stomach and how to stitch a wound clean. Every so often, someone from town would ride out with a gift, smoked ham jars of beans, a roll of cloth for bandages. But no one was ever invited inside. They stood on the porch, placed their offering in her hands, and listened as she smiled faintly and said, "They're all right. Eating well, sleeping peacefully." No one had ever seen them, the soldiers she sheltered. Perhaps it was simple courtesy not to ask. Perhaps it was fear of hearing something they couldn't unhear. In a place where the war's echoes still drifted through the valleys, there was comfort in leaving some doors closed. And so her home on the edge of Lewisburg kept its reputation a last stop for men who had nowhere else to go where they might rest until they were well enough to move on. Only in the quiet memory of the county, no one could name a single man who had ever come down from that house again. In a place like Lewisburg, that might have been enough to keep most people away, but Mrs. Avery's place had a way of brushing off curiosity. Weeks would pass without anyone speaking of it until some small thing brought it back into the room. One such thing happened late in the fall of 1867, when the air had turned thin and dry, and the pine needles in the back lot snapped faintly underfoot like brittle twigs. 3 children from the lower farms had wandered farther than usual that afternoon, scouring the ground for branches dry enough to burn without spitting sap. Their bare hands were red with cold, their aprons heavy with kindling, when they heard a noise carried on the wind from the slope behind Mrs. Avery's garden. It was not the quick rustle of a deer startled from its bed, nor the heavy wing beat of a grouse. It came in short bursts, ragged and low, with pauses that felt too deliberate to belong to any wild thing, the sound of someone trying to draw air through pain. The children stood listening until the chill worked through their clothes, then hurried away without speaking, each certain the others had heard it too. The next morning, a hunter passing along the outer trail near the Avery property claimed he had seen a figure in the same patch of misted ground. The man was missing a leg, his coat a faded union blue that hung loose over narrow shoulders. He was motionless at first, leaning on a rough crutch, staring into the trees as if they might answer him. When the hunter stepped closer, the man turned without a word and limped back toward the Avery house, disappearing into the yard and behind its leaning walls. It was not the sight of the injury that unsettled the hunter. War had made such things common, but the way the man moved, neither in haste nor with the aimless drift of a wanderer. There had been purpose in the turn, but no sign of where it led. Later that day in the post office, someone mentioned the sighting within Mrs. Avery's earshot. She did not look up from the bundle of calico she was sorting. "Old wounds," she said, her voice calm enough to steady the air. "When the cold comes on, it reminds them what they've carried." There was no further comment. The room seemed to fold around her words, as if that explanation was not to be tested. By nightfall, the Avery house was again just another shadow beyond the last street lamp. The children kept their story close, and the hunter told his with a shrug, neither willing to insist on what they had seen or heard. Life in town had a way of smoothing over edges like that, turning them into the kind of tales meant for quiet evenings, not the broad light of day. And so whatever sound had risen from behind Mrs. Avery's garden faded into the wind and the pine boughs, leaving nothing but the sense that it might come again. In the weeks before the higher mountain roads would be sealed by snow, Reverend Josiah Holt rode the long back ways through Virginia into West Virginia, asking after a young veteran named Elijah Griggs. The boy had been under his care once when Holt served as a Union Army medic. Elijah was barely 20, then thin-faced, restless, with a way of speaking that made every hope sound like a certainty. Since the war's end, Holt had thought of him as a younger brother, someone he might yet steer toward a quieter life. But no one in Elijah's home county had seen him for months. The last letter anyone could remember mentioned a journey north and a string of small jobs to pay for it. Somewhere along that trail, the words had stopped. Holt carried with him a list of towns and crossroads where Elijah had been pieced together from farmers, ferrymen, and the porch talk of men who liked to recall the names of every soldier who passed. In one such hamlet, a storekeeper leaned across the counter, lowering his voice as if the walls might overhear. "There's a widow near Lewisburg," he said, "takes in wounded men. Can't say as I've seen one come back, though." The road into the outskirts of Lewisburg wound past pastures hemmed by split-rail fences, then narrowed to a rutted track where the grass had begun to grow back through the wheel marks. The late autumn air sharpened as the sun slid lower behind the ridges. By the time the house came into view, a low structure of mismatched boards under a roof of weathered tin, Holt could smell wood smoke carrying the faint sweetness of apple peel. The woman at the door was lean, her hair drawn back in a knot, her eyes measuring without hostility. "You'll be wanting Mrs. Avery," she said, though she wore no sign of surprise at his arrival. "I'm told some of my people may have come through here," Holt replied. "One in particular." Her gaze flicked toward the yard, then back to him. "We've sick men inside. No room for strangers, but you can bed down in the cowshed if you've a mind to. There's a blanket there and the wind doesn't cut so hard." Holt inclined his head in thanks, masking the calculation behind his eyes. From the shed, he could see the back corner of the house and a narrow run of earth leading toward the garden. The night came on quickly, a moonless dark that thickened in the trees. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called, and then the air grew still enough that every shift of the timbers around him seemed louder. It was well past midnight when he heard it, a sequence of knocks muffled but distinct from somewhere beyond the rear wall. 3 sharp taps, a pause, then 3 more, the cadence, as even as any signal passed between pickets during the war. Holt sat upright on the hay, his mind reaching back to the field hospitals, the prisoners tapping messages through cellar beams. He waited for it again, but the next sound was only the slow creak of a door's hinge and the faint crunch of footsteps on frost. By morning, the yard was empty except for a bucket of feed left near the shed. Mrs. Avery greeted him with the same reserved courtesy, offering no mention of the night. Holt did not press her. A man searching for the truth in such a place learned to let silence answer first. The night after Holt left Lewisburg, the weather turned without warning. A low roll of thunder came first, swallowed quickly by the hills, followed by rain that fell in long, slanted sheets, working its way through the pine boughs and into the soil. By dawn, the dirt road from the southern farms was a string of puddles, each one clouded with the red clay that had bled from the slopes. Holt returned toward the Avery place under a sky the color of wet iron, his coat carrying the smell of damp wool, his boots gathering a skin of mud at every step. He had no plan more defined than to be seen again to test how the place would shift if it realized he hadn't gone for good. Passing the Avery property, he noticed where the ground behind the house dropped sharply toward the tree line. Rain had eaten away at the slope, carrying with it roots, pebbles, and a sheet of sod that now hung half-detached like a torn rug. Below, half hidden by the churned earth, was the curved lip of stone, low and dark, its center smudged by the kind of shadow that light does not easily enter. The air there was different, colder, stiller, and Holt knew the way such openings kept their own weather. It could have been the mouth of a spring or an old root cellar or something meant to be forgotten. He didn't approach. He stood far enough to keep the distance from turning into suspicion, but close enough to mark the shape in his mind. The sound of water dripped faintly from somewhere inside like the ticking of a slow clock. It was not hard to imagine someone stepping down into that hollow and never stepping back out. The next morning Holt came again. This time the slope showed no sign of the stone lip. Fresh earth had been shoveled into the washout, tamped down in uneven clumps. A scatter of ash lay across it, gray and powdery, with brittle pine needles caught in its surface, as though wind had carried them there, but the pattern was too deliberate, the covering too thorough. Even the scent of wet soil was overpowered by the faint char of spent wood. He walked on, keeping his thoughts behind his teeth. Later that day, at the edge of a clearing where a man was splitting logs, Holt asked if the rain had caused much damage. The man's eyes narrowed, the rhythm of his axe never pausing. "Best leave the Avery place to itself," he said, as if discussing a matter of weather patterns rather than property. Another woman he spoke to near the old mill just shook her head, her hands still deep in the folds of her apron. "Don't go digging," she told him, not unkindly. This land never hurt nobody who didn't go asking for trouble. The repetition of the idea, "leave it alone, don't dig," had the same cadence as battlefield superstition. In the war, Holt had known surgeons who never touched a certain side of a wound for fear of making it bleed again, nurses who refused to move a man's cot for fear he would die before nightfall. Sometimes the restraint was mercy, but more often it was the easier choice to see less to know, less to keep a steady camp, even if the rot spread underfoot. Standing in the damp air, Holt realized Lewisburg had its own version of that code, a quiet that was both shield and shroud. Whatever had been behind that curve of stone was not gone, only covered the way a body is covered when there's no one left to claim it. The rain had passed, but the smell of wet ash still clung to the road as Holt rode down from the ridge into town. The streets of Lewisburg were slick with mud wagon wheels cutting deep grooves that filled with shallow water. A blacksmith's hammer carried above the market chatter, each strike ringing dull against the damp air. Holt followed the sound. He told himself it was for a horseshoe, but the truth was that any place with fire and men at work might be looser with their words than the porches where old women sat guarding their gossip. The forge stood at the end of a narrow lane, its open front spilling heat into the chill afternoon. Inside, a man was bent over the anvil shoulders, hunched in a way that spoke of old injury. His left leg dragged slightly as he shifted, and his back arched higher on one side, the outline of a spine that had learned to work around pain. The right eye wandered toward the far wall as if unwilling to meet its twin. His hammer rose and fell in a rhythm both mechanical and weary. Holt waited until the hammer paused over the anvil before stepping inside. The air smelled of iron coal and the faint tang of old sweat baked into leather aprons. "Afternoon," Holt said, letting his voice travel just enough to be heard over the hiss of steam from the quench bucket. The man gave a short nod, but didn't speak. Holt let his gaze wander across the racks of tools, tongs, chisels, nails in neat rows, before he said, "Name's Holt. Just came down off the ridge." The hammer didn't fall again. It stayed suspended a heartbeat too long, then came down once softly, as if the anvil had turned to wood. Slowly, the man turned to face him fully. That wandering right eye fixed itself now, and the good one studied Holt's face as though it were a page he'd read before but hadn't expected to see again. "You've been up there?" the man asked. Holt nodded once. The man's gaze lingered on him, traveling from boots to collar, searching for something, a limp, a pallor, the slackness in the eyes that marked a man who'd left too much of himself behind. Whatever he looked for, he didn't find. Finally, he set the hammer down on the anvil and said low, "Then you're still alive." It wasn't a question. It was a sentence heavy with the kind of certainty that comes from having seen the opposite happen too many times. Holt felt the space between them shift, the forge suddenly smaller, the air thicker. "You know the place?" Holt asked. The man didn't answer right away. He reached for the quench bucket, dipped a strip of hot iron until it hissed and spat, then laid it aside. Only then did he say, "Once, long ago." His voice had the rasp of coal dust in the lungs. There was more behind those two words. Holt could hear it. The kind of once that wasn't measured in years, but in the distance a man puts between himself and a memory. He didn't press. Not yet. Instead, Holt picked up a stray horseshoe from the bench and turned it in his hand. "Looks like you do good work," he said. The man, Corporal Isaac Lott, as Holt would later learn, only gave the faintest shrug. "Work keeps the hands busy," he said. "Busier they are, less the mind wanders." The hammer rose again, ending the conversation. Holt stepped back into the lane, the sound of iron on iron chasing him into the gray light. Lott's words stayed with him all the way to the boarding house. They were not the words of a man indifferent to the ridge. They were the words of a man who had been there, walked out under his own power, and knew that was the exception. Holt found Isaac Lott again the following afternoon, sitting on a low bench behind the forge with his bad legs stretched out and his shirt clinging to his back in the heat. The forge fire was dead now, the air thick with the smell of iron and ash, and the hammering noise that had filled the shop earlier was replaced by the steady drip of cooling metal in a trough. Holt stood for a moment in the doorway, unsure whether Lott would even speak to him. That one sentence from the day before, "Then you're still alive," had lodged in his mind like a burr, catching at every thought since he'd left the shop. Lott didn't look up when Holt stepped closer. He seemed to be studying the dirt between his boots, turning something over in his hands, a bent nail rubbed smooth at the head. "You want to know why I said it?" Lott muttered finally, his voice low enough that Holt had to lean in. "You want to know about Mrs. Avery's place?" The telling didn't come quickly. Lott let the silence gather for a while, as if he had to decide which parts of the memory could be spoken without the weight of them sliding back on top of him. When he did begin, it was without any dramatic flourish, just the flat tone of someone walking through a place in his mind he had never left. "It wasn't bad at first," he said. "You get there, you're half-starved, you can't sleep for the pain, and suddenly you've got a hot meal in front of you, clean bedding, a roof that doesn't leak." She kept the rooms warm, always warm. And there was a rule, too, actually. You didn't ask anyone their name, and you didn't leave the house. Not for wood, not for air. She'd say it with a smile, like she was doing you a kindness. "Don't remember your name anymore, son. Remembering will hurt." Holt could see it in his mind. As Lott spoke, the wood-paneled room with a fire at one end, men in worn uniforms or mismatched clothes, sitting quietly, each looking into nothing. They slowed down after a while. Lott went on. "Stop talking much. Not like they were dying. Just something gone from behind the eyes. You stop thinking about the day you'll walk out because somehow it doesn't matter anymore. Lot paused, the bent nail tightening in his hand. I didn't sleep right. Bad dreams kept me up. One night I lay there listening. The house was too still. I went down the back stairs real careful and found the door to the cellar open. There was light down there and a smell. Not rot, not yet. More like the inside of a tannery where they soak hides. The words came slower now, like he was choosing each one to avoid something worse. There was a table not flat but hollowed in the middle like it had been worn that way. And a boy. Couldn't have been more than 19. Leg was bad bandaged, but he wasn't gone. I could see the pulse in his neck. His eyes found me, and I swear he tried to speak. But he couldn't move straps at his chest and arms. Head set into a notch so he couldn't turn it. She was there standing beside him with that same calm face. Told him, don't fight the wound anymore. It's time to sleep deep. Then she pushed a needle into his wrist. Lot swallowed hard. I watched him breathe fast 3-4 times, then stop. Just like that. No pain, at least not the kind you can see. But I knew he could have lived if anyone had wanted him to. The forge behind them gave a sharp tick as a coal shifted, and Holt realized his own fists had clenched. I didn't wait for her to see me, Lot said. Went back up, grabbed my coat, and was gone before the moon cleared the town. Slipped on the rocks at the creek, smashed my leg. I crawled until I found a road. That was 20 months ago. I've never been back. For a moment, Lot looked up, meeting Holt's eyes for the first time since he started talking. There was no plea there, no warning, just the dull knowledge of someone who had learned how far people will go when no one is watching. If you're thinking of going there again, he said quietly, don't think you can change anything. That house isn't a place you walk out of twice. The smell of ash seemed stronger now, though the forge had gone cold. Holt left Lot sitting on the bench, bent nail, still turning between his fingers, and stepped out into the street, where the light was already beginning to thin. The words clung to him, not just the account, but the way Lot had told it without heat or hope. When Holt stepped out of the forge, the late light in the street had already turned the dust into a thin veil of copper. The sound of the hammer had stopped behind him, but its rhythm still seemed to echo in his chest, alongside the images Isaac Lot's words had left there. He had heard battlefield accounts before. Years in the army hospital tents had inured him to the rough and the pitiless, but there was something in Lot's halting voice, something in the way his good hand curled against his thigh that made it impossible to dismiss. Holt walked the length of Main Street without seeing the faces that passed him. By the time he reached the hitching post, his decision was already made. The road back toward the Avery property felt different the second time, narrower somehow, as if the trees had drawn closer since his last ride. The pines leaned over the track, their tops stirring against one another with a sound like low conversation. He let his horse take the incline slowly, and the air grew cooler with each bend. Where the path curved around a stand of bare-limbed maples, he looked back and saw Lewisburg vanish behind the shoulder of the hill, swallowed as if it had never been there. A part of him knew that turning back now would be the easiest thing in the world. Slip the rein, turn the horse, let the distance fold, closed. But the image of Elijah's face, the way it might look pale under that same lamplight Lot had described, kept him moving forward. By the time Holt reached the break in the trees where Avery's roofline came into view, the sun was already low enough to paint the metal sheeting a dull red. The yard looked unchanged, the lean-to, the woodpile, the same scatter of chicken feathers near the fence. But he noticed details he had not before: the shallow furrow of wheel ruts in the side path, the darkened patch of soil near the back corner of the house where grass had not grown back. Avery stepped out from the kitchen door just as he dismounted, wiping her hands on her apron, her eyes narrowing a fraction before she smiled. "You've come back," she said, the words carrying neither welcome nor suspicion, just observation. "I'm looking for somewhere to rest these next nights," Holt told her, pitching his voice to a weary register. "The spine's been acting up. Cold weather sets it off worse than usual." Avery tilted her head as if measuring the truth of it. "Cold makes old wounds speak louder," she agreed, and motioned for him to follow her toward the back of the house. He noticed she didn't offer the porch steps, but steered him instead to the kitchen door. Inside the room was dim and warmer than he expected, the air holding the faint musk of drying herbs and something sharper beneath. She asked about his injury. Each question light in tone, but precise, as if she were making a record in her mind. How long ago? Which side did the surgeons take all the bone splinters? Her hands moved efficiently as she spoke, setting water to heat, taking down a tin from the highest shelf. When she pried off its lid, Holt caught the scent at once, the sharp medicinal bite of carbolic acid. It was the kind of smell that clung to the canvas walls of field hospitals, to the skin of surgeons who had worked through the night. He had not expected to find it here, miles from any physician, in a kitchen that looked otherwise untouched by anything newer than the war. Avery poured the hot water into a chipped mug and sprinkled in something from the tin. The steam carried the smell more strongly, now threading through the air, until it seemed to coil around him. She set the mug before him with a small, knowing nod, as if this were the proper beginning for any guest in her care. Holt let his hands rest around the mug, feeling the heat soak into his fingers, and understood that the distance between his questions and her answers was about to close, or else vanish altogether. When Holt stepped out of the forge, the late light in the street had already turned the dust into a thin veil of copper. The sound of the hammer had stopped behind him, but its rhythm still seemed to echo in his chest, alongside the images Isaac Lott's words had left there. He had heard battlefield accounts before. Years in the army hospital tents had inured him to the rough and the pitiless, but there was something in Lott's halting voice, something in the way his good hand curled against his thigh that made it impossible to dismiss. Holt walked the length of Main Street without seeing the faces that passed him. By the time he reached the hitching post, his decision was already made. The road back toward the Avery property felt different the second time. Narrower somehow, as if the trees had drawn closer since his last ride. The pines leaned over the track, their tops stirring against one another with a sound like low conversation. He let his horse take the incline slowly, and the air grew cooler with each bend. Where the path curved around a stand of bare-limbed maples, he looked back and saw Lewisburg vanish behind the shoulder of the hill, swallowed as if it had never been there. A part of him knew that turning back now would be the easiest thing in the world. Slip the rein, turn the horse, let the distance fold closed, but the image of Elijah's face, the way it might look pale under that same lamplight Lott had described, kept him moving forward. By the time Holt reached the break in the trees where Avery's roof line came into view, the sun was already low enough to paint the metal sheeting a dull red. The yard looked unchanged. The lean-to, the woodpile, the same scatter of chicken feathers near the fence. But he noticed details he had not before: the shallow furrow of wheel ruts in the side path, the darkened patch of soil near the back corner of the house where grass had not grown back. Avery stepped out from the kitchen door just as he dismounted, wiping her hands on her apron, her eyes narrowing a fraction before she smiled. "You've come back," she said, the words carrying neither welcome nor suspicion, just observation. "I'm looking for somewhere to rest these next nights," Holt told her, pitching his voice to a weary register. "The spine's been acting up. Cold weather sets it off worse than usual." Avery tilted her head as if measuring the truth of it. "Cold makes old wounds speak louder," she agreed, and motioned for him to follow her toward the back of the house. He noticed she didn't offer the porch steps, but steered him instead to the kitchen door. Inside the room was dim and warmer than he expected, the air holding the faint musk of drying herbs and something sharper beneath. She asked about his injury. Each question light in tone but precise, as if she were making a record in her mind. How long ago? Which side did the surgeons take all the bone splinters? Her hands moved efficiently as she spoke, setting water to heat, taking down a tin from the highest shelf. When she pried off its lid, Holt caught the scent at once, the sharp medicinal bite of carbolic acid. It was the kind of smell that clung to the canvas walls of field hospitals, to the skin of surgeons who had worked through the night. He had not expected to find it here, miles from any physician, in a kitchen that looked otherwise untouched by anything newer than the war. Avery poured the hot water into a chipped mug and sprinkled in something from the tin. The steam carried the smell more strongly, now threading through the air until it seemed to coil around him. She set the mug before him with a small, knowing nod, as if this were the proper beginning for any guest in her care. Holt let his hands rest around the mug, feeling the heat soak into his fingers, and understood that the distance between his questions and her answers was about to close or else vanish altogether. The steam rose in thin curls from the cup, carrying with it the sharp metallic note of something more than leaves steeped in water. Holt lifted it slowly, feeling the faint warmth bleed into his fingers, and let the liquid touch his lips without taking it in. The taste that reached him was not simply bitter. It was medicinal, like the residue that clung to the rim of field bottles in the last winter of the war. Balsam and tannin. Yes, but with an undertone he could not mistake carbolic's acrid ghost muted beneath the sweetness of honey. Across the table, Margaret Avery's eyes moved not to his face, but to the cup itself, following each tilt as though measuring his swallow. Her own plate sat untouched, save for the heel of cornbread she had broken neatly into two. The meal was spare, a thin stew of beans and ham shank, a few greens wilted in lard. It was the kind of supper that left no traceable memory except for the tea, and the tea was all she seemed to want him to have. Holt let the cup lower to the table with a soft clink, shaping his mouth into the faint, appreciative curve he had seen soldiers give to nurses they did not trust. When her gaze drifted toward the hearth, he let the liquid slip past his teeth into the napkin folded in his lap. The fabric caught it silently, growing warm against his palm. In the hush that followed, a sound rose from beyond the thin plank wall, faint at first, then sharper with each repetition. Something heavy dragging across a rough surface, punctuated by short, strained breaths. Holt kept his eyes on the cornbread in front of him, listening to the rhythm: scrape, pause, scrape again. Then came a murmur, low and coaxing words bent by effort. He could not make them all out, but one phrase carried clear through the join between boards. "It's almost done." Maribel stood to fetch more wood from the box near the door, her skirts brushing the corner of the table. The moment her back turned, Holt shifted slightly, angling his ear toward the wall. The dragging stopped, replaced by the creak of something settling under weight, then a faint metallic rattle chain, perhaps, or hinges. When she returned, the noises faded as if someone had stepped back from whatever they were tending. She placed the logs on the fire one by one, each drop sending a brief shower of sparks upward. The warmth spread unevenly into the room, leaving the corners still cool. Holt let his gaze wander there deliberately, as if making idle note of the shadows. She followed it, but instead of glancing toward the wall from which the sounds had come, her eyes lingered on him, watching for a reaction she did not get. They ate in measured silence. Holt forced himself to take slow spoonfuls, letting her believe the bitterness in the tea had dulled his senses. Outside, the wind scraped over the eaves and rattled the latch on the outer door. Somewhere to the rear of the house, a shutter swung once, twice, and then stilled. When the bowls were empty and the fire had burned low enough to need tending, she excused herself to the back room. Holt heard the muffled click of a bolt, followed by the soft thud of her steps moving away from the center of the house, toward the place where the dragging had come from. He folded the damp napkin into his coat pocket and rose without sound. If he was to see the truth hidden under this roof, it would have to be before morning, and without her knowing he had ever left his chair. Holt waited until the last ember in the stove sighed into darkness, counting the slow minutes by the faint ticking of a tin clock in the hall. When the boards above creaked with the steady rhythm of someone turning in bed, he eased away from the table, leaving the empty cup upright as though nothing had been touched. The back door stuck in its frame, and he pressed his palm flat to still the hinge before it could speak. Outside, the night air was heavier than he expected, wet from the earlier rain, and it carried the scent of soil recently turned. The grass was slick underfoot, clinging to his boots as he followed the darker line of the path toward the garden. Somewhere close, an owl gave a short, flat call, then fell silent. The mound where the earth had been disturbed after the storm loomed pale in the dim light. At its edge, nearly hidden beneath a scatter of pine needles, was a door of warped planks, small enough that he would have to stoop to enter. The latch was simple, just a loop of rusted wire, and his fingers worked it free with slow care. When the door came open, the smell rolled out first, a mixture of damp stone, old wood, and the acrid ghost of carbolic acid. He recognized it instantly, the way a battlefield medic knows the scent of his own tools. A narrow flight of earthen steps led down to a low chamber lit only by what the moon could spill through the gap behind him. Along the wall sat a rough bench, and on it a row of wooden boxes. Inside the first lay rolls of gauze browned at the edges, glass syringes with clouded barrels and scalpels dulled from long use. These were not the belongings of a farm household. No one in this part of Greenbrier kept such instruments unless they had worn an apron in a field hospital. The second box held a shallow tin basin, still lined with lint, as though it had been set down mid-task and forgotten. Against the far wall stood a narrow cupboard with its door ajar. Holt stepped closer, his boot sinking slightly into the packed dirt, and pulled it wide. Inside, stacked with neat care, were folded slips of cardstock medical tags from both sides of the war. Some stamped USA, others CSA. The ink long faded but still legible in the right light. Beneath them lay a folded certificate of nursing service, the paper gone brittle, its Confederate seal half worn away. He lifted it and felt the dry crack at the crease. Under that, wrapped in oilcloth, were several collodion photographs. Soldiers posed stiffly, their faces, either hardened with the knowledge of injury or softened by the morphine haze. Some sat with bandaged arms, others bore the marks of amputations. On the bottom shelf lay a dress, the faded blue-gray of an army nurse's uniform, creased and freckled with dark stains. The brass buttons were dull, but still fastened as though it had been taken off in a single motion and never worn again. The sight of it drew an involuntary breath from him, the kind he had learned to hide on long marches past the wounded. Whatever else she was now, Margaret Avery had once stood in the thick of the war, her hands in the same work as his, seeing the same blood. And yet the orderliness of these things, kept like trophies instead of tools, told him this was not about memory, it was about purpose, and it was not finished. The narrow steps creaked as Holt shifted his weight, the air growing cooler and heavier with each cautious step upward. The cellar's first chamber had been a place of tools, labels, and method, an archivist's room for the trade of keeping people alive, or perhaps deciding when they would not be. But the second level felt different even before he reached it, as though the boards themselves had absorbed something more intimate than the smell of disinfectant. The beam from his lantern spread over a low-ceiling space where dust moved like pale smoke. The first thing he noticed was a stone table pushed against the far wall, draped in a length of faded muslin. On it stood a small wooden frame, its surface worn smooth from years of being picked up and put down. The photograph inside was a collodion print, its emulsion cracked in a spiderweb pattern. A man in plain civilian clothes stared into the camera with a mouth that held no trace of a smile. Beside him stood a boy, no more than 8 or 9, dressed in a too large coat with sleeves rolled at the cuffs. Their faces were not alike yet. Their posture matched stiff-backed shoulders, squared, the kind of pose taught to people who knew a lens might be the last witness they would ever have. Turning the frame in the light, Holt found a faint line of ink scrawled along the bottom edge on the road from Richmond. Beside the frame lay a folded scrap of newsprint, brittle and thin, the headline barely holding together, 2 civilians found dead on the road from Petersburg. Believed left behind during retreat. The dateline placed it near the war's final days, when armies had splintered into desperate columns and the countryside was a corridor of hunger, cold, and frightened stragglers. The brief article gave no names, only a description of a man and a boy who had succumbed to exposure after being abandoned. Next to the clipping rested an envelope that had never seen a stamp. The paper was thick, the edges blunted by handling, as though it had been kept in a pocket for years before being set here. Holt eased out the single page inside. The handwriting was neat, deliberate, the ink faded but unbroken. "When the war is over, I will come home." It was signed only with an initial, the curve of the letter pressed hard into the paper. No date, no address. Standing there, Holt could almost see the shape of it, a nurse walking through the last days of the Confederacy, carrying not only her kit, but the hope of finding 2 faces along some ragged road. The war had ended for the nation, but not for her. Every patient since then, every man who arrived under her roof, might have been a fragment of that lost promise, Someone to be kept watched over, perhaps held too long in that moment before the end. If her husband and child had been left to die within sight of help, then mercy for her may have ceased to exist. Holt let the letter fall back into place, the envelope closing over it, like a mouth holding its words. Around him the room seemed to press in the lantern's light, flattening into the edges of the stone. There was no sound except the faint hiss of the flame, and beneath it, the slow pulse of his own breathing. Whatever truth lay here had long ago hardened into something unmovable, but he knew the path it pointed to. The answers would not be found in paper or photographs. They would be waiting somewhere beyond this room in the living shadows of the house above. He had just stepped back from the stone altar when the air shifted, subtle at first, like the faint change in pressure before a storm. Then came the weight of footsteps, slow and deliberate, descending into the earth. The smell of kerosene seeped in before the light did, a thin thread of oil and heat winding its way down the narrow shaft. Shadows trembled along the walls, stretching and shrinking in uneven rhythm. Holt stayed still. His breath measured his hands at his sides, as if he were no more than another forgotten object left in this place. The doorway filled with her figure before the lamp she carried revealed her face. The years had carved it into sharp, enduring planes, the skin drawn but not frail, her eyes quick under their hooded lids. The iron frame of the lantern caught the edges of her jaw in thin strips of gold. She did not flinch at finding him here among the remnants and dust she had kept sealed from the world. Her gaze moved over the photographs, the worn uniform, the folded letter, as though measuring how much he had already seen. When she spoke, her voice was low, but without hesitation. "There are some," she said, as if reciting a truth that had been tested and found sound, "for whom death is the only thing left I can give." The syllables landed without rise or tremor, her tone stripped of plea or defense. It was the same cadence Holt had heard in field hospitals when a surgeon delivered a verdict over the din of saws and shouted orders, final, unadorned, unquestionable. She stepped further in the light rolling ahead of her, pressing the darkness back into the corners. The lantern's glow touched the edge of the altar, the scattered instruments, the paper curling at its corners with age. Her shadow, cast tall against the wall, leaned over him like a figure prepared to close a door. Holt felt the coolness of the underground close in again, the stone and earth carrying the echo of her words longer than the sound itself. Her free hand rested on the door frame, not blocking the exit, so much as marking the threshold between the world above and the place he stood in now. In the lamplight, the lines at the corners of her mouth did not speak of cruelty, only of a long habit of making decisions others could not bear to name. Somewhere overhead, a draft carried the faint patter of rain against the yard, but it felt remote, as if the surface belonged to another season entirely. Holt met her eyes, searching for the flicker of doubt that might let him step past her. There was none. Only the steadiness of someone who had already outlived too many choices, who had stopped asking whether the living could be kept whole. She shifted her grip on the lantern, turning slightly as though inviting him to follow. Yet the invitation felt more like an instruction, one given not in expectation of refusal, but as a matter of course. The narrow stair behind her seemed to climb, not toward light, but toward whatever came next. And Holt, knowing the night was not finished with either of them, moved. The kitchen was warmer than the damp air of the cellar, though Holt could not tell whether it came from the small iron stove or from the quiet presence of its keeper. Mrs. Avery set the lamp on the table, its yellow light drawing the edges of her face into sharp relief rather than softening them, and poured tea into two mismatched cups. The steam curled in slow threads, faintly scented, and Holt kept his hands wrapped around the porcelain without drinking, remembering the bitterness in the earlier brew. She lowered herself into the chair opposite him with a care that suggested she had learned to save her strength for moments when it was needed. For a while, the only sound was the slow, steady tick of a wall clock, the pendulum swinging just beyond the lamp's glow. When she began to speak, it was without ceremony, her voice falling into the air as though she were continuing a conversation they had started years before. She told him about the field hospitals in winter, when the canvas walls let in the wind, and the cold made the smell of blood sharper. Men barely past boyhood were brought in with half their bodies gone, still shouting for mothers who could never reach them. The surgeons, she said, did what they could, but there were nights when the morphine ran out and the screaming went on until voices broke and throats bled. She spoke of men who clung to life long after their bodies had failed them, eyes clouded yet wide, each breath dragging them deeper into pain. There were doctors who refused to stop, not because there was hope, but because they could not bear to admit the fight was already lost. Stitches were sewn into limbs that would be cut away before dawn, and the patients thrashed under restraints until the lantern light seemed to tremble with them. Her gaze stayed on the grain of the table as she described hours spent prolonging what could not be saved, the cruelty of giving a man time only so he might feel more of the wound. The living, she said, sometimes looked on the stillness of the dead as if it were a prize, and in those moments the word mercy shifted its meaning depending on which side of the bed one stood. She did not raise her voice or let it tremble. Instead, she spoke with the evenness of someone who had carried one conviction through the collapse of a world and into whatever came after. There are times, she said, when the only thing left you can give a man is an end. The phrase hung there, neither invitation nor challenge, and Holt noticed the way her hand rested not far from the drawer beside her knee. He kept his eyes on her face. Not the drawer, but the nearness of her fingers to the handle settled into his mind like a fact to be measured. It was not fear that came over him, but a calculation the way one might reckon a crossing in a swift river. She sipped her tea without hesitation and set the cup down with deliberate care as if marking the close of a quiet game whose rules only she understood. The clock ticked on steady and patient, its sound folding itself into the pauses between her sentences. Holt felt the weight of her attention on him, not pressing but persistent, as though she were listening less to his silence and more to what it revealed. She had not asked him what he had seen below, and he had not offered to tell. Yet the air between them seemed crowded with the knowledge of it, the boxes and instruments in the cellar, the papers and uniforms that carried the dust of another decade. The memory of the faint dragging sound he had heard earlier in the evening drifted back to him uninvited and sat in the room like a third presence. The tea cooled in his hands, and still he did not drink. Her eyes stayed on him not in suspicion but in a watchfulness that had its own kind of gravity. It occurred to him that she might not be seeking agreement, only recognition, a sign that he understood the boundary she drew between cruelty and kindness, and the place where she believed one became the other. The lamplight caught the curve of the kettle's handle, glinting briefly before slipping back into shadow. Outside, the wind pressed against the house in long, low sighs, and the boards underfoot gave the occasional settling groan. When she finally leaned back, the movement was small, almost imperceptible, but it broke the stillness enough for Holt to draw a breath he had not realized he was holding. She did not smile or frown. Her expression carried the same composure it had when she first entered the kitchen, a balance that could tip either way without warning. The space between them was unchanged. Yet Holt understood that the conversation had been less about the past she described than about the present they shared. Her words had offered no confession, but they had not denied anything either. The clock ticked on, and Holt felt the room grow heavier rather than lighter, as though each passing second was another measure of how far this night might yet go. Mrs. Avery didn't take her eyes off him, and as he pushed the chair back, the scrape of its legs across the floor felt like a long cut tearing through the silence. He turned toward the door, wanting the sense of the cellar of the story she had just told to remain behind him like a dark patch on the wall. But before he could cross the distance between the table and the threshold, she moved. Not quickly, not in a way that was clearly blocking him, just a step into the exact line he would have to take. This close, Holt could see the lamplight clinging like a thin yellow film to her cheekbones, the deep lines carved into her face as if by a dull blade. Her voice dropped lower even than the ticking clock in the corner. "There are some things that shouldn't leave this house." He didn't have time to reply before her hand left the back of the chair and drifted toward the kitchen counter. For a moment, Holt thought she meant to pour more tea until her fingers closed on the handle of the oil lamp. With a sudden turn of her wrist, the dark liquid inside arced through the air, tracing a curve before splashing across the floorboards. The sharp smell of kerosene rushed up, and with the wick still glowing red, the fire caught as if it had been waiting. Flames bloomed low along the ground, red and orange, their violence throwing both their shadows into a nervous jitter on the walls. Holt stepped back on instinct, and that was when he saw the glint of metal in her hand. A kitchen knife, slender but long, the steel edge catching the firelight. She didn't scream, didn't rush in the blind rage he might have expected. Every step she took was calculated just enough to push him backward, just enough to keep the blade in a place he couldn't ignore. The floor underfoot began to warm the heat from the burning oil spreading like an unseen rug beneath them, rising in waves through the soles of his boots. He could feel pockets of hot air curling around his heels, the wood popping and cracking like a quickened heartbeat. When she swung, Holt leaned away, dropping low so the knife only sliced the air near his temple. He felt a few strands of hair stir with its passing, a strange chill running down his spine, in the middle of the heat pressing in from all sides. The oil-soaked tablecloth had begun to smolder, sending thin curls of smoke into the shifting light that made her face change from severe to almost serene, and back again. Holt edged sideways, bumping into the table, his hand finding the door latch behind him. She stepped closer, the blade tilting down toward some weakness she had already measured in him. He wrenched the door open, the hinges screaming, and the cold night air surged in, making the flames shudder. She said something, not a threat, but more like a final warning, her words half lost beneath the sound of burning wood and the hiss of wind through the frame. Holt didn't turn to catch it. He only felt the syllables drop behind him like stones into a deep well. He crossed the threshold in a rush, the heat still licking at his neck, his boots slipping for a moment on the damp ground of the yard. The smell of burning oil clung to his coat, tangled with the smoke beginning to pour from the window frame. The darkness outside wasn't safety, not exactly, but at least it didn't hold a knife and a creed for killing. Holt kept running, stopping only when the light from the kitchen had collapsed into a faint blur beyond the tree line. He looked back once, unsure whether in that flickering firelight Mrs. Avery was still standing, or had already retreated deeper into the house. All he could see was the fire climbing the door frame, small embers torn loose by the wind drifting across his sight like fragments of memory that would never fully sink. Then he turned away, leaving behind the unanswered question of what became of that woman and that house, a question that years later would still follow him back to Lewisburg. Holt had not thought of that house in years or so, he told himself, but the road found him all the same. The tires hissed over the last stretch of gravel outside Lewisburg and stopped where the track narrowed to weeds, and when he stepped out, the air carried a smell he had almost convinced himself he'd invented. It was faint, just the ghost of something sharp and medicinal under the resin of pine, yet it loosened the knot of memory so quickly he could feel the heat on the back of his neck again, the weight of the doorknob in his palm, and the shadow of her voice calling after him through the crackle of burning oil. The house waited just beyond the thinning trees, not so much abandoned as set apart, its siding dulled to the color of ash window frames, sagged inward glass long since gone. The roofline had bowed a tired gesture against the pull of years, but the outline was the same as it had been the night he'd run square solid, giving nothing away. He stood at the edge of the clearing, unwilling to step onto the yard. The grass had grown high in clumps that bent under their own weight, leaving narrow animal paths threading toward the porch. The steps were still there, though the top one had collapsed, leaving a dark gap like a pulled tooth. It should have been nothing more than an empty shell, a place time had finished with. Yet from the far side, just above the line of the roof, a thin column of smoke drifted into the pale afternoon sky. It rose without hurry, too steady for the wind to break, and the smell reached him a moment later, not wood smoke, not cooking, but the same biting scent he'd first noticed years ago in the kitchen, cutting through the damp like a blade through cloth. The smell of carbolic, the smell of wounds. He told himself it could be anything. A hunter dressing game in the woods, a camper boiling water, some local boy fooling with a chemistry set in a shed. But no sound followed it, no hammering, no voices, not even the shift of a branch under weight. The house seemed to be listening as much as he was. The porch boards mute, the door closed, but not locked the way it had been before. His hands stayed at his sides, fingers flexing once, then still. He knew if he walked across the yard up those steps, and through that door the smoke would have a source, a pan on a stove perhaps, or a basin set under a window, and the walls would smell as they once had when she moved through them. He also knew that if he left now, turning his back as he had before, the questions would follow him into every quiet room he entered for the rest of his life. The wind shifted, carrying the smoke toward the far fields, and for a moment he could see it lose its shape, dissolving into the colorless air until nothing remained to mark where it had begun. He thought of the ground behind the house, the slope where the pine needles lay deep and undisturbed, and of how easily they could hide what no one had tried to find. Names without stones, stones without names. He remembered her at the kitchen table, eyes fixed on the knot in the wood, speaking of hours spent keeping a man alive so he could feel each breath as another wound of mercy, as a gift you gave only once. No apology, no boast. Only the certainty of someone who had learned to call an ending by a different name. The column of smoke thinned, wavered, and drew itself apart until it was no more than a pale smudge against the trees. Holt stayed where he was, not trusting the distance between his boots and the porch to remain the same if he looked away. He tried to picture the room beyond the door, the table with its mismatched cups, the clock with its slow, even pendulum, and found the image too clear, as if nothing inside had changed. His chest felt tight the way it had in the seconds before the lamp fell, when he understood that some lines could not be walked back across once you set foot over them. He did not call out. There was no name that would have been answered. He did not move forward, and he did not turn away. The house held its silence, the trees standing watch on either side, and the air between him and the porch seemed to deepen, carrying the memory of her voice not as an echo but as a weight. He stayed there until the smoke was gone, until even the smell had lifted, and then he let the road take him back toward Lewisburg, knowing the house would still be there whether he saw it again or not. If this story has left a stillness in you that no wind can quite carry away, then you already understand. Tales like this were never meant for comfort. They were meant to linger, to follow you long after the last image fades. Because what happened outside Lewisburg wasn't only about a single woman or one house set back from the road. It was about the ground that swallows its secrets, the neighbors who choose not to see, and the faith that can be bent into a blade. And it is not finished. If this has stayed with you, share it with someone who does not flinch when history turns cold. Someone who knows that remembrance is not just for the graves that bear names, but for the ones the moss has already claimed. And if you want to hear more stories like this of ledgers gone missing, soil turned without witness, and the voices that were never meant to carry beyond the trees, consider subscribing. This channel isn't about horror, it's about witness. Tell us what remains with you. Do you believe the last truth of Lewisburg has been told? Or do you think there are still rooms sealed, still markers pulled from the earth, still thin columns of smoke curling above that house when no one should be there? This is not where the road ends. There are more doors that will not stay shut, more ground that will not keep quiet, and more hands waiting for the dark to fall.